Hello. Some of you might be wondering what happened to me over the past few days. And the answer is that I was in bed a lot of the time. Not really ill, but extremely tired. And that was because I'd had my COVID vaccination, the first one of the Oxford, the AstraZeneca one. Now, I want to tell you what happened, and then I'm going to be talking about vaccination generally. What happened to me that started me thinking about vaccination generally was this. I had the vaccination in the morning and I was fine for the rest of the day. And then towards the late afternoon, I started to feel very tired. And I went to bed rather early, about maybe 7 o'clock, something like that. I just felt like I wanted to lie down. And I dozed and then woke up at about midnight, maybe a little bit thereafter, just feeling awful, just awful. I didn't have a fever. I actually checked my blood oxygen. I had one of those things you put on your fingers. There's nothing wrong with my blood oxygen. And there was no fever. But I did have that awful super sensitive feeling you get when you've got flu and everything, anything that touches your skin is painful. It feels sore. And my neck felt very, very painful, really. And I had the mother of all headaches. I asked my husband to massage my neck because I felt it had tightened up so much, but I couldn't bear him touching me. That's how sensitive I was. And I thought, I'd read that the more you allow the reaction to happen, the better it is for you. So I tried not to do anything. But by about, 3 in the morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. The headache was getting worse and I took a paracetamol. And that worked like magic. I mean, it was amazing. I had the paracetamol and, the sensitivity went and the headache went. Whatever was wrong with me could be fixed by one paracetamol, then there couldn't have been that much wrong with me, if you see what I mean. But I was very, very uncomfortable. And the next day, I just didn't feel like doing anything. I was just extremely tired. I spent most of the day in bed, dozing, getting up, doing stuff. I did cook. I made dinner for us and everything, but that was all I did that day. Oh, and I did the Telegraph. You could tell how bad I was. It took me almost all day to finish the Telegraph crossword, which made me rather annoyed with myself. I thought, when that goes, everything's gone. However, the next day I was fine. So very, very slightly tired, but look, I'm up, I'm dressed. I'm more or less on the ball and I'm making videos again. So my brain's started to crank into action again. But I was sort of ill, that's for sure. Now, it isn't usually the case that you get ill after a vaccination. I have been ill after the flu vaccination, mind you, which is why I haven't had flu vaccinations for several years. But it occurred to me that when it comes to coronaviruses, we are actually back in the 18th century. We are at that level of technical sophistication, or rather unsophistication. And we have to obviously go through this before things get better. Now, vaccinating against a coronavirus has not really been done that well before. The common cold is a coronavirus, and it's a meme of medical history that we've managed to get rid of X and Y, and we still can't get rid of the common cold. And that's because of the variability of it. But that's because they were going after the common cold in the way that they went after other diseases that just stayed the same. And that's why they have to do the flu virus, for instance, every year, because it mutates. So what was necessary was to find some part of the coronavirus that does not mutate and go for that. And that required a high degree of technical sophistication and expertise. And because of the worldwide effort to deal with this highly infectious plague, and it's not a joke. It's definitely not a joke. You couldn't get all these countries agreeing on the same joke. You wouldn't get Russia agreeing with America on that joke together. It just wouldn't happen. Well, look, let's go to this. I want to talk about the beginnings of vaccination, which is, of course, the smallpox vaccination. And originally, they weren't called, in English, they weren't called vaccinations. And if you don't know why they're called vaccinations, now you're going to learn something. It was originally called variolation. A variola is the bump you get from stuff like chickenpox or smallpox, you know, the little blister that turns into a lump. Now, I want to tell you about smallpox because not many people know of the horrors that this disease was. Disfiguring is hardly the word you could use to describe it. It turned an ordinary person into a monster. It frequently killed, and it very frequently blinded, because if you've got the variolas on your eyes, it destroyed your eyes. It was a horrendous disease. And because we have vaccination against it now, nobody knows how horrendous it is. I'll tell you how horrendous it is. I wanted to put up some pictures of what happened to smallpox victims who survived. And, well, worst cases, some survived with not that much scarring. But I wanted to put up some pictures of people who got the worst of the scarring, and I just couldn't do it. I know that the video would be taken down straight away. It's so horrific. But all you have to do is just Google smallpox scarring and see. There's just some truly awful, awful illustrations. Queen Elizabeth I got smallpox, and she got away with it with a few scars, but from then after, she was wearing about half an inch of makeup on her face. One of her ladies in waiting caught smallpox from her, and I remember her husband, who was away at the time. This lady went back to her home, and the husband said something like, "I left my wife, a beautiful woman, and when I got back, I found as foul a lady as smallpox could possibly have made," something like that. He was still a good husband to her, but she was horribly disfigured. Now, the beginnings of vaccination in the West, variolation, and I'll tell you why it was called variolation in a minute, was started by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And she discovered that in Turkey, people were protecting themselves from smallpox by the following method. They actually took the dried scabs of smallpox variolas, the blisters. They dried the scabs and made them into a powder, and then blew the powder into the nose of whoever they were trying to inoculate. This gave the person smallpox. But you see, because the scabs, most of the time, because the scabs were dried, the virus would have been slightly attenuated. And so they got a mild form of smallpox, and this gave them a resistance to the disease for the rest of their lives. Sometimes that didn't work. Now, Lady Montagu took this method back to Britain and convinced the royal family to do this. She had her child infected in this way in Turkey, and when she got back to Britain, she pointed out her child's health and succeeded in getting the royal family to do that to their children. One of the children died George III's, one of George III's infant sons died of this method of vaccination, of inoculation. And if that's not enough to drive somebody mad, then what is? But the rest of the family survived. It was very hit and miss, because you may have more or less dead virus there. You're blowing up your nose, but it may be quite active as well, or you may be particularly susceptible. This was in 1717. And then in 1721, it was introduced to America, not by Lady Montagu, but by an African slave. Let's see. It says here, in Massachusetts, Cotton Mather learnt about the practice from his slave, Onesimus. Mather publicised the technique, and the procedure was first tried during a smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721. That was a gift, wasn't it? However, it has to say that the idea was abroad anyway. They might have read about it also from Lady Montagu, because that was years earlier. And certainly the news would have crossed the Atlantic by that time. All right, so that was the original smallpox resistance fight, the variolation, which took the attenuated virus from an active disease and introduced it into the human body, gave a weakened version of the disease, and then this conferred immunity. Now, this was the only way to do it until a country doctor called Edward Jenner discovered something else. In Britain, you'll see it in literature, people talk about somebody having the complexion of a milkmaid. It had been noted that milkmaids had very beautiful, unscarred complexions, basically, which had been attributed to them living clean, healthy lives of virtuous work. But it wasn't that. It was this. The milkmaids caught a disease from the cows they were milking. It was known as cowpox, and it gave you the same sort of blisters as that. They closely resembled smallpox, but they healed up. They didn't leave you scarred. The legend usually repeated is that Jenner, a family doctor from Gloucestershire, had observed that milkmaids working in the countryside around his hometown of Berkeley had remarkably clear complexions and were never afflicted by the scars of the feared disease smallpox. When he asked about this, he was told they had all contracted cowpox in the course of their work, and it was that protected them from smallpox. So people realised that this was an immunity. But they weren't medical, so they just accepted that. So it says here that Jenner decided to try and experiment. When Sarah Nelms consulted him about the blisters she'd acquired after milking a cow named Blossom, the doctor acted quickly. Using pus from Nelms's lesions, he deliberately infected James Phipps, the 8-year-old son of his gardener, first with cowpox and later with smallpox. To everyone's relief, James did not contract smallpox. Now, this sounds thoroughly awful. It wasn't quite as bad as that. Because Jenner had been collecting evidence about cowpox before that. For many years, actually, before that, he'd been dealing with this. And what he did was he took the fluid from a cowpox blister on Nelm's hand, and he did scratch it into the skin of James Phipps, and Phipps developed cowpox, which was an uncomfortable but ultimately not a particularly dangerous disease. And then later on, some months later, I think, Jenner gave the child the standard smallpox variolation system. That is, he took some powdered variola and blew it or scratched it on. I think in Britain they didn't blow it up people's noses, they just scratched it on the back of their hand. And the child didn't develop the usual symptoms of smallpox, of a mild form of smallpox, which was the general case when you had the variolation. So it wasn't like he was using the kid as a complete guinea pig. And this is a picture of Jenna vaccinating a child, not Phipps. This is one of those romanticized pictures of it, but basically that's what was going on. And when this became, when the original variolation system became generally known, it attracted the same sort of people. Now, they get the disparaging term anti-vaxxers. I don't want to insult anti-vaxxers. They have a point. And I want to tell you that doctors, properly qualified doctors, have doubts about certain vaccines. And that's reasonable enough. But I also want to remind you that doctors used leeches for thousands of years and hundreds of years after it was more or less recognised that they didn't do any good in most cases. And also I want to point out that doctors didn't listen to a doctor called Semmelweis, who realised that puerperal fever, which is the disease that women frequently got in hospitals in the early 19th century, they got this fever because the doctors were performing autopsies and then would go straight from the autopsies with the blood still on their clothes into the lying-in ward. And Semmelweis did tests showing that hand disinfection between the autopsy room and the lying-in ward would stop the puerperal fever, and nobody took any notice of him, even though when he was in charge of a maternity unit, he cut the deaths to practically zero. But nobody in the medical profession took any notice of him, and he finally died in a lunatic asylum, I believe. He just went mad from people not listening to him. So I just want to point out to you that doctors are not gods. They are subject to their own prejudices. And so for good or ill, doctors may say vaccinations are good and they may be wrong, and they may say vaccinations are bad and they may be wrong. Ultimately, we have to make our own decisions. And here you see a couple of cartoons about vaccination, in which you see this woman here, she's being vaccinated, and the others who've previously been vaccinated are having cows sprouting from their bodies, because that's how people felt about it. They were frightened of this new thing. Oh, by the way, I didn't mean to tell you, the Latin for cow is vacus, V-A-C-C-U-S. And so vaccination was actually being injected with cows, being cowed in basically. So you can see, he'd chosen the wrong word, because as soon most people knew Latin, most educated people knew Latin, they heard the word vaccination, and this is what they thought of straight away. Cows sprouting from your body. Look, this cow coming from this man's arm, and horns developing on this woman's head. I think it's a woman. It might not be. And this is an even worse cartoon. It shows people feeding their children into this monstrous cow. So you see, it's a natural thing that people are afraid of such things. And indeed, I could be all wrong. I'm just telling you my personal opinion and my personal experience. But I am interested that I had a vaccination, which, by the way, had nothing to do with cows anymore. I had a vaccination and it made me ill. not as ill as COVID would have made me. And I assume my husband had it, he wasn't ill. And I assume that's because I'm the sort of person who reacts very strongly to all sorts of things like that. I have a lot of allergies as well. So I think if I had COVID, it would have been a lot worse for me. And that's why the vaccination was a lot worse for me than it has been for some of my friends. For instance, I've spoken to a few people who've had it, and some of them have had no results at all, and some have been really, one woman told me she was in bed for 3 days. Well, I just managed a day. So anyway, that's it. That's my experience with the COVID vaccine. I did, somebody emailed me, and I did tell him that I hadn't been active because I wasn't feeling well, and why. And he said, well, you hear such awful things about the COVID inoculation that I hope you're all right. Well, yes, you know, I'm sure there are going to be tragedies with the inoculation, just like there were tragedies with the attempts to fend off smallpox. But smallpox was a desperately awful disease which people were prepared to take the risk for. Now, I want to finish with talking about the percentages here. About 2% of victims of COVID become seriously ill. That's not a high percentage. 2% is not a high percentage. So you may think, well, you know, is it worth taking the risk? Well, look at it this way. I'm talking about Britain now. Britain has a population of, we're told, 70 million. It might be nearer 80 million with a lot of illegals here, but let's say 70 million. 2% of 70 million is about 1.5 million. That's a lot of people to be seriously ill. Now, obviously, they're not all going to be seriously ill at the same time. The problem with COVID is that it is highly infectious, so a very high proportion of the population is going to be infected, and 2% of that is going to be quite high. Now, let's just get rid of the children, although some children have been very badly affected. Let's say half the population is at risk of being very, very ill. So that's 2%, not of 70 million, but of 35 million. And 2% of 35 million would be about sort of 750,000 people, something like that. Maybe a bit less, maybe 600,000. That's still a lot of people. 600,000 people is a lot of people. And of that, the people who are ill don't just become ill and stay in intensive care for 3 or 4 days before the ventilator does its job and then they go back to a convalescent ward of some sort. People who get COVID are ill for a long time, weeks. They are taking up intensive care beds for maybe a month at a time, and then they might die. Or they might survive and require extra special nursing care for several weeks thereafter. So that is a big problem for any health service, even the best. And that's the problem. And that's why we can't stay in lockdown all the time. So that's why, in the interests of greater society, I feel that we have to take the risk. And I just want to tell you all that having had the vaccination, it hasn't changed my opinion of Bill Gates, not even a little bit. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and T-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.